The emergency lighting cast an eerie purple glow throughout the bridge of the Imperial warship Eternal Glory. Captain Feller's hands trembled as he adjusted the radiation shielding for the third time in as many hours. Behind him, what remained of his bridge crew worked in tense silence, broken only by the occasional spark from damaged consoles or the whine of failing power systems. 3 light years. They'd made it 3 light years from the battle site, and still the radiation warnings flashed across their sensors. He could still see it when he closed his eyes, the massive flash of light that had consumed their fleet, their emperor, their future. Not one nuclear detonation, not 10, but hundreds, thousands. More than every nuclear weapon ever detonated in the history of his species combined. Captain, his sensor officer called out, voice rough from the smoke that still lingered in the ship's air. Power fluctuations in sections 3 through 7. Life support is failing in those areas. Feller nodded wearily. Seal those sections. Move any surviving crew to the forward compartments. He didn't need to ask how many crew were left. The number was burned into his mind: 142 survivors from a complement of 2,000. Each death weighed on him, each loss a testament to their species' arrogance. The humans had warned them. That was the part that aided him the most. They'd warned them, explicitly and repeatedly, about their nuclear capability. The Imperial High Command had laughed it off as primitive posturing. Nuclear weapons? In space combat? It seemed absurd, backwards even. Their civilization had moved past such crude implements of war centuries ago. But they hadn't understood. The humans hadn't kept nuclear weapons because they were primitive. They'd kept them because they had mastered them, embraced them, turned them into an art form of destruction that no other species could comprehend. A distant vibration shuddered through the ship's hull, and Feller gripped his command chair. The Eternal Glory had once been the pride of the Imperial fleet. Now she limped through space, her reactor barely containing itself, her once gleaming hull pocked and scarred by nuclear fire. Engineering reports the starboard stabilizers are gone, his second-in-command reported quietly. We're running on emergency power and prayers, sir. Prayers. Feller almost laughed. What good were prayers against a species that had turned the power of suns themselves into weapons? A species that had lived so long under the shadow of atomic fire that they had ceased to fear it. He stared at the tactical display, watching for any sign of pursuit. The humans would come. Of that, he was certain. They would hunt down every last vessel that had participated in the attack on their colonies. It wasn't even vengeance, it was methodology. Thoroughness. The same calculated brutality that had led them to turn space itself into a nuclear killing field. Set course for the outer rim, he ordered, and begin compiling our sensor data from the battle. When they catch us, I want there to be a record. A warning to any other species that thinks the humans' reliance on nuclear weapons makes them primitive. His crew acknowledged the order, but he could see the same bitter knowledge in their eyes that burned in his own heart. They had lost. Not just a battle, but everything. Their empire lay in ruins, their emperor was dead, and their mighty civilization had been humbled by a species they had dismissed as backwards. And somewhere out there the humans were coming, with their nuclear torpedoes, their plasma webs, and their terrifying acceptance of atomic fire as just another tool of war. Feller closed his eyes, but the afterimage of the fleet's destruction still burned there, a testament to their fatal underestimation of humanity's resolve. They had thought the humans primitive for clinging to nuclear weapons. They had been so terribly, catastrophically wrong. Feller watched as his medical officer treated the radiation burns on a young technician's hands. They'd had to manually seal the bulkheads in Section 5 when the automated systems failed, and even with protection, the residual radiation from the battle had left its mark. The sight brought back memories of how this all began, memories he wished he could burn from his mind. It was supposed to be simple, he muttered, more to himself than to the officer. Standard Imperial protocol. Strike their outer colonies first, demonstrate our overwhelming force, accept their surrender within days. The medical officer looked up, her 4 eyes blinking in sequence. I remember the first attack, sir. New Phoenix colony. They barely had orbital defenses. Feller nodded grimly. The humans' response had been so measured, so tactical at first. They'd evacuated civilians with remarkable efficiency, fallen back to defensive positions, fought conventional battles with conventional weapons. The Imperial command had been pleased everything was proceeding according to predictions. Then came the Battle of Proxima. The first nuclear torpedo caught us completely off guard, Feller said, his voice hollow. High Command thought it was a malfunction when the readings came in. Nuclear weapons? In void combat? The sheer inefficiency of it, the radiation risks to their own ships. It seemed like madness. He remembered the laughter in the command briefing room, the sneering dismissal of human tactics. Nuclear weapons were useful for planetary bombardment, certainly, but in ship-to-ship combat, it was like bringing a stone axe to a plasma duel. Then they'd seen the pattern. The humans hadn't launched their nuclear weapons randomly. Each detonation had been precisely calculated, creating overlapping fields of plasma and radiation. Ships that tried to escape one blast found themselves caught in the expanding wave of another. We lost 30 ships in that first engagement, Feller continued, watching as the medical officer applied regenerative gel to the technician's burns. But more than the ships, we lost our understanding of what we were fighting. These weren't the actions of a primitive species clinging to crude weapons of mass destruction. This was the work of a civilization that had spent centuries perfecting the art of nuclear warfare. A warning klaxons interrupted his dark reminiscence. A nearby console showed new damage reports from the engine section. The radiation from the battle was playing havoc with their systems, just as it had during that first encounter. Even their most advanced shields, designed to deflect energy weapons and plasma bolts, had proven inadequate against the sheer volume of nuclear detonations. Do you know what truly terrified me? Feller asked, helping the technician to his feet. It wasn't just their willingness to use nuclear weapons. It was their crews. They flew through their own nuclear firestorms without hesitation. Their ships were built not just to survive nuclear war, but to wage it actively. His communications officer called out from across the room. Sir, we're picking up encrypted transmissions. Long range, but the pattern matches human military bands. Feller felt his heart sink. They were already being hunted. What did our pre-war intelligence say about humans? He asked rhetorically, moving back to his command station. That they were a fractious species, dozens of competing nations, constantly on the brink of destroying themselves with their own nuclear arsenals. We thought that made them weak. He laughed bitterly, watching the tactical display for any sign of pursuit. We didn't understand. They weren't divided, they were steeped in nuclear strategy. Every nation, every ship, every crew had lived their entire lives knowing they could die in nuclear fire at any moment. And instead of abandoning such weapons, they had embraced them, mastered them, turned their greatest fear into their greatest weapon. The young technician spoke up, his voice raw from the lingering radiation. But surely they must fear nuclear warfare as much as we do? The devastation, the long-term effects. Feller shook his head slowly. They do fear it. That's what makes them so dangerous. They fear it, but they've accepted it. Where we see nuclear weapons as a last resort, they see them as just another tool in their arsenal. They call it tactical nuclear warfare, as if there could be anything tactical about splitting atoms. The ship shuddered again, and more warning lights flashed across his console. They were pushing the engines too hard, but they had no choice. Somewhere behind them, humanity's nuclear-armed fleets were closing in. And Feller knew, with cold certainty, that this time they wouldn't just be hunting for victory. They would be hunting for vengeance. The Emperor's final transmission still played in Feller's mind, an endless loop of their civilization's greatest mistake. The humans will not dare use nuclear weapons against a full Imperial battle fleet approaching their homeworld. They would risk nuclear winter on their own planet. Press the attack, accept nothing less than total surrender. Those had been his last words before the transmission cut off, before everything changed. Feller stood at the viewport of the Eternal Glories Bridge, staring at the distant stars. Each one could now hide a human fleet waiting to finish what they'd started. His hands clasped behind his back to hide their trembling not from fear, but from the radiation exposure they'd all endured during their desperate escape. Captain, his tactical officer called out softly, "I've finished compiling the battle data you requested. Would you like to review it?" He didn't want to. The memories were still too fresh, too raw, but they needed to understand, needed to document exactly how thoroughly they had misread their enemy. "Display it," he ordered, turning from the viewport. The holographic display flickered to life, showing the Imperial fleet in all its glory. 10,000 ships, the largest armada ever assembled in known space, advancing on the human homeworld, Earth. Such a simple name for a planet that would become their empire's grave. "We detected their nuclear launch platforms powering up," the tactical officer narrated, his voice clinical, detached. "It was easier that way. All of them. Not just their orbital platforms, but launches from their planet's surface, from their colonies, from ships we didn't even know existed." The display showed the first wave of human missiles. Not the hundreds they had expected. Not even the thousands they had feared. Tens of thousands. "Our analysts said it was a bluff," Feller whispered. "They said no species would risk that level of nuclear saturation in near-orbital space. The debris alone would make their planet uninhabitable." But the humans hadn't targeted their planet. Every single warhead had been aimed at the Imperial fleet. The hologram showed the first detonations. The Imperial fleet's defensive screens had caught many of the missiles, just as planned. Their point defense systems had destroyed thousands more, but there were just too many. 3,000 years of Imperial supremacy, Feller said, watching as the holographic ships began to die. 3,000 years of uncontested dominion over the stars, and humanity ended it in less than a day. The tactical display showed the brutal efficiency of the human strategy. The first wave of detonations had created a massive electromagnetic pulse, temporarily blinding Imperial sensors. The second wave had targeted their screening vessels, creating a wall of nuclear fire that trapped the main fleet. The third wave. Feller closed his eyes, but he could still see it, still feel it. The humans had turned space itself into a weapon. The overlapping nuclear detonations had created a plasma storm unlike anything their scientists had thought possible. Ships that weren't destroyed outright found their shields, failing under the constant radiation bombardment. Those that survived that had their crews killed by the radiation that pierced their hulls. "We never understood what we were fighting," he continued, forcing his eyes open. "We thought we were facing a primitive species that clung to nuclear weapons out of technological limitation. Instead, we fought a civilization that had spent centuries preparing for nuclear war on a scale we couldn't even imagine." The hologram showed the final moments of the battle. The Emperor's flagship, pride of the Imperial fleet, disappearing in a flash of nuclear fire. The desperate attempts at retreat turned into a chaotic rout. The terrible realization that the humans had stationed nuclear-armed vessels behind their fleet, cutting off their escape routes. "Shut it off," Feller ordered. The hologram vanished, leaving them in the dim emergency lighting of the bridge. A sudden alert caught their attention. Long-range sensors were picking up radiation signatures, human signatures. "They're still coming," his second-in-command said quietly. "Even after all that, they're hunting down survivors." Feller nodded grimly. Of course they were. That was something else they should have understood about humans. They didn't just fight wars, they finished them. "Send out another burst transmission to any Imperial vessels that survived," he ordered. Tell them what we learned too late. The humans don't just use nuclear weapons. They've mastered them. They've turned them into an art form. And they will use them again and again until there's nothing left to use them on." The ship shuddered beneath his feet as they pushed their failing engines harder, fleeing from the nuclear-armed hunters that followed in their wake. Behind them lay the graveyard of their empire's ambitions, a cloud of radioactive debris that had once been the mightiest fleet in known space. All because they had made one fatal mistake. They had assumed that humanity's willingness to use nuclear weapons was a sign of weakness, rather than recognizing it as the terrible strength it truly was. "How do you teach fear to an entire species?" Feller asked the empty air of his quarters. The question had haunted him through sleepless cycles as the eternal glory limped through space. On his desk, reports of failing systems piled up alongside lists of crew members who had succumbed to radiation poisoning. A sudden tremor ran through the ship, and he steadied himself against the wall. Their port engine was failing, another casualty of their desperate flight. Soon they would have no choice but to drop out of faster-than-light travel, and then... His communications officer's voice crackled over the intercom. "Captain, we've received responses to our warning broadcasts. 3 Imperial vessels have acknowledged receipt. 3 ships. Out of thousands." Feller closed his eyes, letting that number sink in. "Any word from the homeworld?" "No, sir. Just chaos on all Imperial frequencies. The government is. There isn't really a government anymore. The Emperor's death, the loss of the fleet. Everything's falling apart." Of course it was. Their civilization had been built on the absolute certainty of Imperial military supremacy. Now that certainty had been shattered by nuclear fire, and their entire society was unraveling. The door chimed, and his tactical officer entered, carrying a data pad. "Sir, I've completed the analysis you requested. About the humans' nuclear capability." Feller gestured for her to continue. It's worse than we thought, sir. The weapons they used against our fleet? They were holding back. Our long-range sensors detected stockpiles 10 times larger than what they deployed. They could have destroyed us several times over." Holding back, Feller barked out a bitter laugh. "They used more nuclear weapons in one battle than our entire species has in its history. How could that possibly be holding back?" "Because they were being precise," the tactical officer explained, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Each detonation was calculated for maximum tactical effect, with minimum collateral damage to their own infrastructure. They weren't just throwing nuclear weapons at us, sir. They were conducting nuclear warfare with the same precision we use particle beams." Feller stood and moved to his viewport, watching the strange patterns of FTL space distort the stars. "We thought we understood warfare. We thought we had mastered it. But we never understood what it meant to be human." He turned back to his officer. "Did you know they spent centuries pointing nuclear weapons at themselves? Their own history speaks of something called the Cold War, where they lived every day knowing they could be annihilated at any moment." "That should have broken them," the tactical officer said quietly. "No," Feller replied. "It forged them. Where we developed beyond nuclear weapons, they developed with them. Every advancement in their technology, every strategic doctrine, every ship design, all of it was built around the assumption that nuclear warfare wasn't just possible, but probable." His desk computer chimed with another damage report. 3 more crew members had died from radiation exposure. They had sealed off another deck due to containment failures. "We thought their reliance on nuclear weapons was a weakness to exploit," Feller continued. "We never considered that they had spent generations turning that weakness into an insurmountable strength. Every human crew member grows up knowing they might die in nuclear fire. Every human ship is built to fight in conditions that we considered unsurvivable." The tactical display on his wall suddenly flashed red. Long-range sensors had detected radiation signatures consistent with human warships. "They're still following us," the tactical officer whispered. "Of course they are," Feller replied, his voice heavy with resignation. "That's another thing we should have understood about humans. They don't just fight wars, they inhabit them. Every human knows their history, knows what happened to their cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They've spent centuries living with the knowledge of what nuclear weapons can do." He moved to his desk and began recording what might be his final warning to any civilization foolish enough to challenge humanity. "They call it mad mutually assured destruction. We thought it was a sign of their barbarism, their inability to move beyond the threat of nuclear annihilation. We were wrong. It wasn't a limitation. It was a philosophy, a doctrine, a fundamental understanding that if you fight humans, you must be prepared for nuclear war, not as a possibility, but as an inevitability." The ship shuddered again, more violently this time. Their port engine had finally failed. They would have to drop out of FTL soon, and when they did... "Sir," his communications officer's voice crackled over the intercom. "We're picking up transmissions. The humans. They're broadcasting on all frequencies. They're offering terms." Feller's hands clenched on his desk. Terms. After everything, after the absolute destruction they had wrought, they were offering terms. Because that was another truth about humans: they had failed to understand they were capable of mercy, even after unleashing the power of the atom. But it was too late for mercy. Too late for terms. All they could do now was warn others, try to prevent another species from making their same fatal mistake. The humans were coming, and they were bringing their nuclear fire with them. The Eternal Glory's last functioning engine died with a whimper rather than a roar. Feller stood on his bridge, watching as the swirling patterns of FTL space collapsed back into normal space, revealing a field of distant stars. Stars that could no longer offer them escape. Multiple contacts, his sensor officer reported, voice trembling, human signatures. They're everywhere, sir. Of course they were. The humans had herded them here, like prey into a trap. Every jump, every course correction, every desperate attempt at escape had been predicted and countered. They had never stood a chance. Sir, his communications officer called out. They're broadcasting again. Same message as before. They're offering terms for our surrender. Feller moved to the center of his bridge, looking at each member of his surviving crew. They were all watching him, waiting for his decision. Some showed fear, others resignation. A few still harbored hatred in their eyes, but even they knew the truth now. Put it on speakers, he ordered. A human voice filled the bridge, speaking perfect Imperial standard. Imperial vessel Eternal Glory, this is Fleet Commander Childress of the Earth Defense Force. Your engine's signature indicates critical failure. You have nowhere left to run. Submit to boarding and guarantee the safety of your crew, or... The voice didn't need to finish the threat. They all knew what humans were capable of, what they would do if provoked. Sir, his second-in-command asked quietly. Your orders. Feller took a deep breath. Before I give them our answer, there's something we need to do. Something important. He turned to his communications officer. Are we still broadcasting our warning signal? Yes, sir. Strong and clear. Good. Because there's one last thing the galaxy needs to know. He straightened his uniform, a habit from a life that seemed centuries ago now. Record this. He looked directly into the pickup, imagining future generations of spacefaring species who might see this warning. To any civilization receiving this message, what I am about to tell you may save your species from extinction. Do not, under any circumstances, provoke humanity into nuclear warfare. What you are about to see in this region of space. The radioactive debris field that was once the greatest fleet in Imperial history, let it stand as a testament to our failure to understand one simple truth. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Humans don't just use nuclear weapons. They don't just understand nuclear weapons. They have achieved something far more terrifying. They have normalized nuclear weapons, where we see them as a last resort. Humans see them as a valid tactical option. Where we see them as a weapon of absolute desperation, humans see them as just another tool in their arsenal. The tactical display showed human ships moving into position around them. Dozens of them, each carrying enough nuclear weapons to vaporize a small moon. Their children grow up practicing for nuclear war. Their ships are built assuming nuclear combat. Their entire civilization has spent centuries living under the shadow of atomic fire, and instead of being broken by it, they have embraced it, mastered it, turned it into an art form that no other species can comprehend. Warning signals flashed as the human ships charged weapons. Not nuclear missiles yet. They were still waiting for his response to their terms. You might think, as we did, that their reliance on nuclear weapons makes them primitive. You might believe, as we did, that their willingness to use such weapons makes them barbaric. You would be wrong. Catastrophically wrong. When you fight humans, you aren't fighting soldiers. You're fighting an entire species that has spent its entire existence preparing for the end of the world. He turned to his communications officer and nodded. Send our response to the humans. Tell them. Tell them we accept their terms. The officer scrambled to comply, but Feller wasn't finished with his warning. Remember this, humans don't need to bluff about nuclear weapons. They don't need to make threats. They have lived with these weapons for so long that using them is as natural as breathing. They have turned the most horrific weapons in the galaxy into a science, an art, a doctrine of war that no other species can match. Human boarding shuttles were approaching now. His crew watched them with a mixture of fear and resignation. We thought we could fight humans. We thought we could win. We were wrong. And now our empire lies in ruins, our civilization shattered, all because we failed to understand one simple truth when humans say they will use nuclear weapons. Believe them. When humans warn you about their nuclear capability, heed that warning. He could hear the boarding teams approaching the bridge now. This is Captain Feller of the Imperial warship Eternal Glory, signing off with one final warning: do not fight the humans. They always use nukes. Always. The bridge doors opened with a hiss, revealing armored human soldiers. Feller turned to face them, noting with bitter irony that their armor bore radiation warning symbols. Even their boarding parties were prepared for nuclear combat. He raised his hands in surrender, finally understanding what his civilization had failed to grasp. It wasn't humanity's weapons that made them unbeatable. It was their absolute acceptance of those weapons' horror, their willingness to embrace atomic fire not as a last resort, but as a simple fact of warfare. The humans had warned them. They had warned everyone. And now, the Empire's radioactive grave would stand as a testament to the price of ignoring that warning. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you loved it. Please remember to subscribe if you did like it so you can see more videos like this. And please give us a like and a comment too. I'll see you in the next one.